Welcome, wherever you are in the world right now, whether it is early morning, late at night, or somewhere in between. I'm glad you're here. This space is for slowing down, for thinking carefully, for stepping back from the noise. If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share where you're listening from, in the comments. It's always meaningful to see how far thoughtful conversations can travel. And if these reflections bring you clarity, calm, or insight, subscribing quietly supports the growth of this channel and allows more long-form philosophy to continue. Now, let's begin. How to think clearly in a noisy world. Chapter 1: The Cost of Mental Noise. Clarity has always been rare. In every age, thinkers have understood that knowledge does not merely require information, it requires a certain condition of the mind. A stillness, a discipline, a space in which thought can unfold without interruption. The mind that seeks truth must also be guarded from distortion. And one of the most subtle distortions of the modern world is noise. Noise is not only sound. It is interruption. It is distraction. It is fragmentation. The ancient Stoics believed that a disturbed mind could not judge correctly. For them, mental clarity was not accidental. It was cultivated through restraint and control over impressions. What enters the mind shapes the mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But what happens when those thoughts are constantly interrupted, when impressions arrive not one at a time, but in waves? Modern research confirms what philosophers sensed intuitively. Studies show that environmental noise interferes with working memory, the system responsible for holding and manipulating information in the mind. When background noise increases, performance on complex reasoning tasks declines. The brain diverts energy toward processing irrelevant sound, reducing the cognitive resources available for reflection and decision-making. In simple terms, noise weakens thought. Research on traffic and urban noise exposure has demonstrated measurable declines in attention, reading comprehension, and executive function, especially in children. In classrooms near highways or airports, students show lower performance in language processing and sustained focus compared to quieter environments. This is not merely inconvenience. It is structural interference with cognition. Arthur Schopenhauer once argued that noise is the most impertinent of interruptions because it breaks thought at its root. He considered noise a kind of intellectual aggression, a violation of the inner space required for reflection. Today neuroscience gives this intuition measurable form. When exposed to chronic noise, the body activates stress pathways. Cortisol levels rise, the sympathetic nervous system remains slightly elevated. Even when the sound is not consciously attended to, the brain continues to monitor it for unpredictability. This low-grade vigilance consumes energy. Sleep is damaged by noise pollution too. Studies show that repeated nighttime disturbances impair memory consolidation and emotional regulation. Without deep sleep, the brain cannot properly organize what it has learned. Knowledge fragments, emotional reactivity increases. In other words, noise does not only disturb waking thought, it disrupts the restoration of thought. Friedrich Nietzsche often spoke of the necessity of solitude for higher thinking. He believed that profound ideas emerge not from chaos but from distance, from stepping back, withdrawing, allowing one's own mind to speak without being drowned by the voices of others. He warned that the crowd is loud not only physically but mentally. The herd mentality thrives in noise because noise prevents reflection. When the environment is saturated with stimulation, thought becomes reactive rather than deliberate. Cognitive science supports this distinction. In noisy conditions, reaction time increases and error rates rise. The brain shifts toward quicker, less reflective processing modes. It becomes more impulsive. Clarity demands the opposite. Slow evaluation, sustained attention, layered reasoning. Baruch Spinoza believed that freedom arises from understanding causes clearly rather than being driven by confused impressions. But confusion thrives in environments where impressions arrive faster than they can be examined. Noise accelerates impressions. It overwhelms the filtering mechanisms of attention. Even moderate ambient noise has been shown to reduce performance on tasks requiring analytical reasoning. While some people claim they can tune it out, brain imaging studies reveal increased cognitive load under noisy conditions, meaning the brain is working harder just to maintain baseline focus. Harder effort does not equal better clarity. It often leads to fatigue. Long-term exposure to environmental noise has also been linked to higher rates of anxiety and depressive symptoms. The mind remains in a mild state of alertness, scanning for disturbance. This chronic vigilance undermines inner calm, the very condition required for philosophical reflection. The philosophers of antiquity did not retreat into silence by accident. Plato founded his academy in a grove outside the city walls. Aristotle walked as he taught. Many schools valued distance from the chaos of urban life. They understood something essential: thinking well requires an environment that supports it. In the modern world, noise pollution affects millions daily. Traffic, construction, machinery, constant alerts. The nervous system adapts, but at a cost. Research has linked chronic noise exposure not only to stress and sleep disturbance, but also to cardiovascular strain and cognitive decline over time. This is not dramatic exaggeration. It is measurable biology. The cost of mental noise is cumulative. It fragments attention. It elevates stress. It reduces memory efficiency. It shortens patience. It encourages reactivity, and reactivity is the enemy of clarity. If knowledge is the pursuit of truth, clarity is the condition that makes truth visible. Without clarity, even intelligence misfires. Even education becomes shallow. Even strong opinions lack foundation. In a noisy world, the greatest discipline may not be learning more, but protecting the mind that learns to think clearly is to create interior space, silence. Then, is not emptiness. It is capacity. It is the clearing in which thought can expand. And before one can think clearly in a noisy world, one must first recognize what noise is costing them. Long before cities rose into the sky, before engines and highways and electrical grids, the human nervous system was shaped in a very different soundscape. For most of human history, the dominant sounds were wind moving through trees, water flowing over stone, distant animal calls, insects at dusk, footsteps on earth. These sounds were not random. They were rhythmic, cyclical, seasonal. The wind rises and falls, waves repeat their motion. Birdsong follows patterns tied to light. Crickets begin at dusk and fade at dawn. The auditory world of our ancestors was structured by nature's cycles: day and night, seasons, weather patterns, migration, growth and decay. The nervous system evolved within that rhythm. Unlike mechanical noise, natural sound is rarely abrupt or chaotic. It swells and recedes. It carries gradients rather than spikes. It signals information without overwhelming the senses. Even when intense, like thunder, it resolves back into silence. There is a pattern, a return. Philosophers across traditions recognize this harmony. The Stoics spoke of living according to nature, not merely in moral terms but in perceptual ones. To align oneself with nature meant recognizing that human beings are not separate from larger cycles. We are expressions of them. Heraclitus observed that everything flows, not violently, but continuously. Change was not fragmentation, it was rhythm. In contrast, much of modern industrial sound is discontinuous. It interrupts rather than flows. Sirens pierce, engines drone without variation. Construction pounds without seasonal pause. Artificial alerts cut sharply through attention without warning. The difference is subtle but profound. Natural sound environments tend to support what psychologists now call soft fascination. The mind remains gently engaged but not taxed. Studies in environmental psychology show that exposure to natural soundscapes, such as flowing water or rustling leaves, can lower heart rate, reduce stress markers, and improve cognitive restoration. In contrast, unpredictable mechanical noise keeps the brain in a monitoring state. It demands vigilance. One environment invites contemplation. The other demands reaction. Even the rhythm of the planet itself carries a structure the body understands. The Earth rotates steadily, producing the cycle of light and darkness. Hormones rise and fall in response. The circadian rhythm, the body's internal clock, synchronizes to these planetary movements. For thousands of years, human sleep aligned closely with sunset and sunrise. Sound faded with darkness, it returned gradually with morning birds and wind. Silence was not empty, it was expected. Today, artificial light and artificial sound extend activity beyond natural boundaries. The mind no longer fully descends into quiet. It hovers. Nietzsche once wrote that one must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star, but he did not mean external chaos. He meant creative tension. The external world, he believed, should not constantly agitate the inner one. Solitude and silence were prerequisites for higher thought. There is something deeply stabilizing about sound that follows a pattern larger than the individual. Ocean waves do not rush to finish. Wind does not argue, night does not resist becoming morning. These rhythms mirror the movement of the planets themselves, steady, cyclical, predictable over long spans of time. The Earth orbits the sun without hurry. The moon waxes and wanes without interruption. There is order in vastness. When the mind is immersed in environments shaped by these rhythms, it subtly entrains to them. Breathing slows, thoughts lengthen, reaction softens into observation. Modern neuroscience suggests that rhythmic, predictable auditory input can help regulate the nervous system. The brain prefers patterns it can anticipate. Natural sound offers variation within order, complexity without chaos. Mechanical noise often offers the opposite: repetition without meaning, interruption without resolution. Our ancestors did not need to protect their thinking from engines or sirens. Their challenge was survival in a physically demanding world, but mentally, their environment allowed for periods of deep quiet, especially at night. In that quiet, stories were told, knowledge was transmitted, myths were formed. Reflection took shape around firelight and under stars. Silence was not rare, it was normal. Today, silence has become something one must seek intentionally, and perhaps that is why clarity feels more difficult. The nervous system has not fundamentally changed in a few hundred years. It still responds to rhythm, to natural gradients, to the slow turning of day into night. But the soundscape has changed dramatically. To think clearly in a noisy world may require something ancient, the deliberate reintroduction of rhythm. Moments where sound does not assault but supports. Moments where the mind can expand in sync with something steady and larger than itself. The cost of mental noise, then, is not only stress or distraction. It is disconnection from rhythm. And clarity, at its deepest level, may be a return. Not to silence alone but to pattern. To flow instead of fracture. To steadiness instead of interruption. To the quiet rotation of thought that mirrors the quiet rotation of the earth itself. Thought does not become reactive all at once. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, as the pace of life increases and the mind adapts to constant stimulation. In a quieter world, a person might hear a sound, pause, interpret it, and then respond. There was space between the event and the reaction. That space allowed reflection. It allowed judgment. But when the mind is surrounded by continuous noise, physical noise, informational noise, emotional noise, that space begins to shrink. Reactions replace reflections. The Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, once explained that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the judgments they form about those events. Between the event and the judgment, he believed there must be awareness. A moment of examination. Without that moment, the mind simply reacts. Modern psychology describes something very similar. Cognitive scientists often distinguish between two modes of thinking. One is slow, deliberate, analytical. The other is fast, automatic, and reactive. Both are useful. But when the environment constantly demands quick responses, the slower system becomes underused. The brain begins to rely on shortcuts. These shortcuts, sometimes called heuristics, allow people to respond quickly without deeply analyzing every situation. But shortcuts also increase the likelihood of misunderstanding, emotional escalation, and poor decision-making. When the mind lives in a reactive state, impressions are accepted immediately. They are not questioned. A headline appears and anger follows, a comment is heard, an offense rises, an obstacle occurs and frustration spreads. The reaction feels justified because it happens so quickly that it appears natural, but speed does not guarantee accuracy. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza believed that human freedom depended on understanding causes clearly rather than being carried away by emotional impulses. To him, the unexamined reaction was a form of mental bondage. A person who reacts automatically is not fully directing their own mind, they are being moved by it. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on the discipline of attention. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself to examine his impressions before accepting them as true. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." But that power exists only if a pause is preserved in a noisy environment, both physically and mentally. That pause becomes difficult to maintain. Notifications demand immediate response, conversations overlap. Opinions flood every space. Information arrives faster than it can be evaluated. The mind begins to move at the speed of the environment, and the faster the mind moves, the less clearly it sees. Nietzsche warned that modern society risks producing individuals who react constantly but reflect rarely. When people live surrounded by constant stimuli, they may develop strong opinions, strong emotions, and strong reactions. But without the depth of thought that would normally refine them, reaction creates intensity, reflection creates clarity. These are not the same. When reaction dominates, people begin to interpret the world through emotional momentum. Each new stimulus triggers another quick judgment. Each judgment triggers another reaction. The mind becomes like water in a storm, constantly moving, rarely settling long enough to see what lies beneath the surface. Psychological studies show that when individuals are placed under time pressure or sensory overload, their decision-making becomes more impulsive. The brain favors familiar patterns and emotional cues rather than careful reasoning. This is efficient in emergencies. But most modern situations are not emergencies. Yet the nervous system behaves as though they are. A message arrives and the mind jumps. A notification sounds and attention shifts instantly. An argument appears and the body prepares to defend. Without realizing it, many people spend much of their day in a low-grade reactive state, responding to stimuli rather than directing their thoughts deliberately. Over time, this changes the experience of thinking itself. Reflection feels slower, patience feels difficult. Silence feels uncomfortable, the mind becomes accustomed to movement. And yet the greatest philosophical insights throughout history rarely emerged from reaction. They emerged from observation, patience, and long contemplation. Socrates did not rush toward answers, he questioned assumptions. Spinoza did not react emotionally to events, he sought to understand the mechanisms behind them. The Stoics did not encourage emotional suppression, but emotional examination. They believed that between the stimulus and the response lies the freedom to choose, but freedom requires awareness. When the mind slows down even briefly, something important becomes visible. A thought can be observed rather than immediately believed, an emotion can be noticed rather than instantly acted upon. This moment of awareness is small but powerful. It is the difference between reacting and thinking. Modern neuroscience suggests that practices which slow attention, such as deep breathing, focused observation, or deliberate pauses, can restore activity in brain regions associated with executive control. These regions help regulate impulses and support rational decision-making. In other words, the mind can be trained to reclaim that space. Clarity returns when reaction slows. When the mind stops rushing to conclusions, patterns begin to appear, causes become easier to trace, emotions become easier to understand rather than simply obey. And in that slowing, thinking becomes intentional again. The world may remain noisy. Stimuli will continue to appear. Opinions will continue to compete for attention. But a mind that learns to pause even briefly regains something essential: direction. It becomes capable of observing the world without being pulled immediately into its turbulence. And this ability to pause, to examine impressions, to resist the pull of instant reaction, may be one of the most important disciplines for anyone who wishes to think clearly in a noisy world. Silence, however, carries its own challenge. In the modern world, many people are uncomfortable with it. Not the ordinary quiet that comes from turning down the television or stepping into a calmer room, but real silence, the kind where there is no talking, no music, no background sound, and no constant signals from devices. When that kind of silence appears, people often notice it immediately. The mind begins searching for something to fill the space. A phone is checked, a song is started, a conversation begins, even if there is little to say. The instinct to fill silence has become almost automatic. But the reason silence feels strange is not simply because it is quiet. It is because silence removes the distractions that normally occupy attention. When those distractions disappear, a person is left alone with their own thoughts. And thoughts, when left unattended for long periods of time, can feel disorganized. Questions surface, memories appear, unresolved worries rise into awareness in noisy environments. These inner movements are easy to ignore. Sound fills the gaps. Attention is pulled outward toward the next stimulus. The mind reacts to the environment instead of examining itself. Noise in this sense becomes a form of escape. It allows a person to move continuously from one impression to the next without stopping long enough to reflect on what is happening internally. Silence interrupts that escape. Without external stimulation, the mind begins to turn inward. Thoughts that were previously buried beneath activity start to surface. Emotions that were pushed aside begin to reappear. For someone who is not accustomed to it, this experience can feel uncomfortable. It may even feel like restlessness. Psychologists sometimes describe this reaction as cognitive withdrawal. When the brain loses its usual stream of stimulation, it temporarily struggles to adjust. The mind, accustomed to rapid input, does not immediately know how to behave in the absence of it. So it tries to recreate the stimulation it has lost. This is why silence often triggers the urge to check a phone, turn on a screen, or create conversation. The mind is attempting to return to familiar noise. But if a person remains in silence long enough, something interesting begins to happen. The initial discomfort slowly fades. The nervous system begins to settle, breathing becomes slower. The pressure to react begins to dissolve. Thoughts that once seemed chaotic begin to organize themselves. The mind starts to move differently. Instead of jumping rapidly from one stimulus to another, it begins to follow a single line of thought for longer periods of time. Attention stabilizes. Small details become noticeable. The rhythm of breathing becomes clearer. The weight of the body resting in a chair becomes easier to feel. The surrounding environment, the shape of a room, the softness of light, the subtle movements of air, becomes more apparent. Silence, which once felt empty, begins to feel spacious. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once observed that many of humanity's problems arise from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. His remark was not meant as criticism, but as an observation about the restless nature of the mind. When people are constantly surrounded by stimulation, the skill of being still gradually weakens. And yet stillness is the condition in which deeper understanding often appears. Silence does not demand answers. It does not push a person toward immediate action. It simply creates an environment where awareness can expand. In that environment, thoughts can be examined more carefully. Questions can unfold rather than being rushed toward conclusions. Emotions can be observed rather than immediately acted upon. What once felt uncomfortable begins to feel restorative. The nervous system recognizes that it is safe to relax. Over time, silence stops feeling like something to escape. It begins to feel like something valuable. A place where thinking slows enough to become clear again. In a noisy world, silence may feel unusual at first precisely because it has become rare, but rarity does not mean unnatural. In many ways, silence is closer to the environment the human mind was designed to inhabit. Before constant mechanical sound, before endless digital signals, quiet was a regular part of life. People walked long distances without conversation. Nights unfolded beneath quiet skies. Work was often accompanied by simple, repetitive rhythms rather than endless bursts of information. The mind had time to settle. Today, rediscovering silence requires intention. It means resisting the instinct to immediately fill every quiet moment with sound or activity. But the reward for that intention is subtle and powerful. Clarity begins to return. Thoughts become easier to follow. Reactions become easier to pause. Awareness grows steadier. Silence reveals something that noise often hides: the structure of the mind itself. At first, silence may feel like unease. Later, it begins to feel like rest, and eventually it becomes something worth returning to. Not because silence solves every problem, but because within silence, problems can finally be understood clearly. In a noisy world, the simple act of sitting quietly for a few moments may be one of the most radical steps a person can take toward clear thinking. There is another reason silence feels difficult in the modern world. It requires a skill that many people rarely practice anymore. The discipline of pausing. A pause is a small moment where nothing happens. No scrolling, no talking, no switching tasks, just a brief space where the mind is allowed to sit without stimulation. For many people, that moment quickly turns into something they describe as boredom. But boredom is often misunderstood. Research from psychologists like Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia explored what happens when people are left alone with their thoughts. In one well-known experiment, participants were asked to sit quietly in a room for several minutes with nothing to do. No phone, no music, no distractions. Many participants reported that the experience was uncomfortable. Some found it so difficult to simply sit and think that they chose to give themselves a mild electric shock rather than remain alone with their thoughts. The results surprised many researchers, but it also revealed something important. People were not truly bored. Their brains were reacting to the sudden absence of stimulation. Modern environments train the mind to expect constant input. Notifications, conversations, videos, music, and information arrive continuously. Over time, the brain adapts to this pattern. It begins to expect novelty. When novelty disappears, the brain interprets the change as a problem that needs to be fixed. That restless feeling people call boredom is often just the brain searching for the next stimulus. Neuroscientists often connect this to the reward system involving dopamine. Dopamine plays a role in motivation and anticipation. Each new piece of information, each notification, each interesting stimulus creates a small burst of reward signaling in the brain. Over time, the brain becomes conditioned to seek those bursts repeatedly. So when nothing new is happening, the brain starts sending signals that feel like restlessness. Not because something is wrong, but because the system has been trained to expect constant novelty. The discipline of pausing is the act of gently interrupting that cycle. It means allowing the brain to exist for a moment without immediately feeding it something new. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. The mind may jump from thought to thought. It may try to invent tasks or distractions. You may suddenly remember messages you should check or things you should look up. This is normal. It is simply the brain adjusting to a slower rhythm. But if the pause continues, something subtle begins to shift. The nervous system starts to settle. The urge for stimulation begins to weaken. Thoughts become less frantic and more organized. Instead of chasing the next stimulus, the mind begins to explore what is already present. This is when creativity often appears. Many studies on creativity show that insight frequently emerges during low stimulation moments, while walking, showering, resting, or staring out a window. These are moments when the brain's attention loosens its grip on external input and begins making connections internally. The mind becomes more reflective, more observant, more patient, but this process requires space, and space only exists when a person allows themselves to pause. Pausing does not mean doing nothing in a negative sense. It means allowing the mind to reset its pace, just as muscles need recovery after movement. Attention also needs recovery after constant stimulation. Without pauses, thinking becomes reactive. With pauses, thinking becomes deliberate. This is why many philosophers, writers, and scientists throughout history have valued quiet walks, solitude, and reflective time. They understood something simple but powerful. The mind needs empty space in order to think clearly. In the beginning, that space can feel unfamiliar. The brain will try to convince you that you are bored. But if you remain in the pause just a little longer, you may notice something surprising. The boredom fades and what replaces it is something much more useful. Curiosity. Ideas begin to form. Questions become clearer, and the mind, no longer rushing to chase the next distraction, begins to move at its natural pace again. Pausing, then, is not wasted time. It is the moment when thinking finally has room to breathe. The discipline of pausing also changes the way we respond to the world. Most reactions happen automatically. Someone says something frustrating, and the response appears immediately. A notification appears and the hand reaches for the phone without thinking. A problem shows up and the mind begins rushing toward a solution. This pattern is fast, efficient, and often useful. But it also means many of our thoughts are reactions rather than reflections. A pause interrupts that pattern. Even a short pause, just a few seconds, creates a small gap between stimulus and response. Inside that gap, something important happens. Awareness appears. Instead of immediately reacting, the mind has a chance to observe what it is about to do. You might notice a feeling of irritation before you respond to someone. You might notice the urge to check your phone without actually doing it. You might notice a worry beginning to form before it turns into a long spiral of thinking. These small observations are powerful because they restore a sense of choice. Without pauses, behavior often runs on habit. The brain follows patterns it has repeated thousands of times before. But with pauses, those patterns become visible. And once a pattern becomes visible, it becomes possible to change it. This is why many forms of mindfulness practice begin with something extremely simple. Paying attention to breathing. Breathing is always happening, but most people rarely notice it. When attention moves toward the breath, the mind slows down just enough to observe something steady and rhythmic. The breath becomes an anchor. With that anchor, the mind has a place to return whenever it begins drifting into distraction. Over time, the ability to pause becomes easier. At first, it may only last a few seconds. A short moment where you simply stop and notice what is happening around you, but gradually those moments begin to grow. A pause before responding in conversation. A pause before opening another app. A pause before rushing into the next task. These pauses might seem small, but their effects accumulate. They change the rhythm of thinking. Instead of moving continuously from one stimulus to another, the mind begins to alternate between action and reflection. Activity is followed by stillness. Focus is followed by recovery. This rhythm is much closer to the natural cycles the human brain evolved with. In nature, movement and stillness often appear together. Waves rise and fall, wind gusts and then softens. Animals move with bursts of activity and then long periods of rest. Human attention works in a similar way. It is not designed for endless stimulation. It performs best when periods of focus are balanced with moments of quiet. Pausing restores that balance. It allows the nervous system to reset. It gives the brain time to process information instead of constantly absorbing more of it. And in those quiet moments, something deeper can emerge. Perspective. When life moves too quickly, it becomes difficult to see the larger picture. Attention stays fixed on the immediate task, the next message, the next responsibility. But a pause lifts attention slightly above the noise. From that vantage point, worries that once felt overwhelming may appear more manageable. Problems that seemed confusing may begin to organize themselves. Sometimes the answer to a problem does not appear through intense effort. Sometimes it appears when effort briefly stops. This is why many people experience their best ideas during simple moments while walking, resting, or letting the mind wander quietly. The pause gives the mind permission to explore rather than react, and in a world that constantly encourages speed, choosing to pause becomes a subtle form of discipline. Not a rigid or forced discipline, but a gentle one. A reminder that thinking does not always need to happen faster. Sometimes it simply needs a little more space. When that space appears, the mind begins to remember something it already knows how to do: slow down. Observe and respond with intention rather than impulse. The discipline of pausing, practiced regularly, turns small moments of quiet into something meaningful. Not empty time, but the foundation for clearer thought, calmer reactions, and a deeper awareness of the present moment. One of the most powerful skills for thinking clearly is also one of the most overlooked. The ability to separate facts from interpretations. At first, this distinction seems simple. A fact is something that happens, an interpretation is the meaning we attach to it. But in everyday life, the two often become tangled together so quickly that they feel like the same thing. A message arrives and someone assumes it is rude. A colleague walks past without speaking and someone concludes they are angry. A small mistake occurs and the mind decides it is evidence of failure. In each of these situations, the original event is small and neutral, but the interpretation attached to it quickly transforms the experience. The Stoic philosophers understood this deeply. Epictetus explained that people are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the judgments they form about those events. In other words, the mind adds a story. That story may feel immediate and convincing, but it is still a construction of the mind. This process happens automatically because the brain evolved to interpret information quickly from a survival perspective. Rapid interpretation helped early humans detect danger and make fast decisions. The brain became highly skilled at filling in missing information with assumptions. Modern cognitive science calls this predictive processing. The brain does not passively receive reality. It constantly predicts what things mean based on past experiences. This ability is powerful, but it also introduces error. Psychologists studying cognitive bias have identified dozens of mental shortcuts the brain uses when interpreting events. These shortcuts allow rapid judgment but often distort reality. One common example is the negativity bias. The brain naturally gives more attention to potential threats than to neutral or positive events. This means that when information is ambiguous, people are more likely to interpret it negatively. A short email might be interpreted as irritation, a neutral facial expression might be read as disapproval. But these interpretations often say more about the observer's internal state than about the event itself. Baruch Spinoza approached this issue from a different philosophical angle. He believed that many emotional disturbances arise because people confuse their interpretations with the actual causes of events. Instead of investigating what truly happened, the mind reacts to the story it created about what happened. Spinoza believed clarity comes from understanding causes accurately. When a person sees events as they truly are, without unnecessary interpretation, emotional turbulence begins to decrease. The Stoics called this examining impressions. When an event occurs, the mind receives an impression of it. But the wise person pauses before immediately accepting that impression as truth. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to strip events down to their simplest form. A harsh comment becomes simply a sequence of words spoken by another person. A mistake becomes simply an action that did not produce the intended result. When the mind removes its added narrative, the situation becomes easier to understand and respond to. Modern psychology supports this approach. Cognitive behavioral research has shown that emotional distress often arises from distorted interpretations rather than the events themselves. In therapeutic settings, individuals are taught to identify the difference between observable facts and the stories they tell themselves about those facts. For example, fact, someone did not reply to a message. Interpretation, they are ignoring me. Fact, a presentation did not go perfectly. Interpretation, I embarrassed myself. When the mind slows down enough to separate these layers, the emotional reaction often softens. Friedrich Nietzsche explored a related idea from another perspective. He argued that human beings do not simply perceive the world, they interpret it through values, expectations, and personal history. There are no pure facts without interpretation, he suggested, but there are interpretations that are stronger, clearer, and more life-affirming than others. In this sense, clarity does not mean eliminating interpretation entirely. It means becoming aware that interpretation is happening. When awareness increases, interpretations can be examined rather than blindly believed. This awareness introduces flexibility. Instead of assuming a single explanation for an event, the mind can consider multiple possibilities. A short response from a colleague might mean irritation, but it might also mean they are busy, distracted, tired, or simply brief in communication. Without awareness, the mind chooses the interpretation that appears first. With awareness, it pauses, and that pause creates room for perspective. Scientific studies on emotional regulation show that when individuals deliberately reframe interpretations of events, activity increases in parts of the brain associated with rational evaluation and decreases in areas linked to emotional reactivity. In simple terms, when people question their interpretations, the brain becomes calmer and more analytical. This does not mean ignoring problems or pretending everything is positive. It simply means examining events carefully before deciding what they mean. Real clarity begins when the mind learns to ask a simple question. What actually happened, not what it seems to mean. Not what it reminds you of. Just the observable facts. A colleague spoke in a certain tone. A message arrived late, a plan did not work. When situations are reduced to their factual elements, they often become far less overwhelming. The mind can then move toward the second question. What are the possible interpretations? This question opens the door to curiosity rather than immediate judgment. It transforms reaction into investigation. The Stoics believe that this process strengthens inner freedom. If emotional reactions are tied to interpretations rather than events themselves, then examining interpretations gives a person greater control over their experience. Spinoza believed something similar. Understanding causes clearly dissolves confusion and reduces emotional turmoil. Nietzsche believed that the ability to interpret life consciously, rather than unconsciously, was a form of intellectual strength. In different ways, each of these thinkers pointed toward the same insight. Clarity comes from seeing how the mind constructs meaning. In a noisy world where information arrives rapidly and reactions spread quickly, this discipline becomes even more valuable. Without it, people become trapped inside interpretations they never questioned. With it, the mind regains its ability to examine, evaluate, and choose its responses deliberately. Separating facts from interpretations does not remove difficulty from life, but it removes unnecessary confusion. And when confusion fades, thinking becomes calmer, clearer, and far more reliable. In the next step, clarity moves even deeper, because once interpretations become visible, another ability becomes possible. Learning how emotional control naturally emerges from clear thinking. Separating facts from interpretations has been a central concern for thinkers for thousands of years. Long before modern psychology began studying cognitive bias, philosophers were already asking a similar question: how do we know when something is true, and when we are merely expressing an opinion about it? Plato explored this distinction carefully. He separated two different forms of understanding. One he called episteme, which referred to knowledge that could be examined, reasoned about, and supported with evidence. The other he called doxa, which referred to opinion, beliefs people hold that may feel convincing but are not necessarily grounded in careful reasoning. For Plato, confusion between these two levels of thinking was one of the main reasons people misunderstand reality. Opinions often arrive quickly. They are shaped by emotion, social influence, or personal experience. Knowledge, by contrast, requires examination and patience. In a noisy world, opinions travel far faster than knowledge. Modern communication spreads interpretations instantly. A single event can generate thousands of reactions within minutes, many of them based on incomplete information. The mind absorbs these reactions and begins forming its own conclusions before the underlying facts are fully understood. This rapid cycle of reaction reinforces the very habit that clear thinking tries to resist: the habit of assuming that the first interpretation must be correct. The sociologist Max Weber recognized a similar problem when studying society and politics. In his famous lecture Science as a Vocation, he argued that researchers must carefully separate facts from values. Facts describe what is, values express what people believe should be. Weber believed that confusion between these two categories leads to distorted reasoning. When people present value judgments as if they were objective facts, discussions become tangled with hidden assumptions. A person might describe a policy as obviously harmful or clearly beneficial, when in reality they are expressing a value preference rather than an objective description of the situation. Clear thinking requires noticing that difference. The philosopher David Hume also explored the boundary between facts and human interpretation. He famously observed that many arguments quietly move from describing what is to declaring what ought to be. For example, someone may describe a natural behavior and then conclude that the behavior must therefore be morally acceptable. Hume pointed out that this leap is not logically guaranteed. The facts of a situation do not automatically determine the values attached to it. This insight revealed how easily the mind blends observation with interpretation. Even modern philosophy continues to debate this boundary. The contemporary philosopher, Justin P. McBrayer, has argued that the popular idea that facts are objective and opinions are subjective is too simplistic. Some opinions, he notes, can be evaluated as true or false depending on evidence and reasoning. Saying that a particular food tastes good may be subjective, but saying that a historical event occurred on a certain date is not merely an opinion. The real challenge is not simply separating facts from opinions. It is learning to evaluate claims carefully rather than accepting them automatically. And this challenge becomes much harder in environments filled with noise. Noise does not only refer to sound, it also refers to informational overload. Endless commentary, rapid reactions, emotional headlines, and constant updates create a landscape where interpretation spreads faster than verification. In that environment, the mind begins to mirror the chaos around it. Instead of investigating events calmly, it absorbs the emotional tone of the surrounding conversation. If the environment is filled with outrage, the mind becomes outraged. If the environment is filled with panic, the mind becomes anxious. But when a person learns to pause and separate facts from interpretations, the noise begins to lose some of its influence. The first step is simple: return to the observable, what actually happened, not what others say it means, not what it reminds you of, not what it might imply. Just the event itself. Often the factual core of a situation is surprisingly small. A sentence was spoken, a message arrived late, a plan did not succeed. Everything else, the meaning, the motives, the future implications, belongs to interpretation. The second step is curiosity. Instead of accepting the first interpretation that appears, the mind can explore alternatives. It can ask whether other explanations might exist. Perhaps the colleague who seemed distant was simply distracted. Perhaps the delayed message had nothing to do with intention. Perhaps the mistake that felt embarrassing was barely noticed by others. By expanding the number of possible interpretations, the mind reduces the emotional weight of any single one. This does not mean ignoring genuine problems. Some interpretations are accurate. Some events truly do carry serious consequences, but careful thinking waits for evidence before deciding which interpretation fits reality best. This discipline becomes especially valuable in a noisy world where emotional reactions are constantly encouraged. The environment often rewards speed rather than accuracy. Quick reactions receive attention. Calm examination receives less visibility. Yet clarity belongs to the slower process. The mind that pauses to distinguish facts from interpretations gains something rare: perspective. Instead of being carried away by every new stimulus, it develops a stable center from which events can be examined more carefully. Plato sought knowledge beyond opinion. Weber sought inquiry free from hidden values. Hume exposed the leaps between description and judgment. And modern thinkers continue to remind us that belief, interpretation, and fact are not identical. Each of these perspectives points toward the same practical skill. Learn to see the difference between what happened and what the mind thinks it means. In a quiet environment, that skill is easier to practice. But in a noisy world, it becomes essential. Because the more interpretation surrounds us, the more discipline it takes to return to what is real. And when the mind learns to do that consistently, thinking becomes steadier, calmer, and far more reliable. Clarity is not only something that appears during moments of reflection. It is something that can be cultivated deliberately. Just as physical health improves through consistent habits, clear thinking strengthens through daily practice. Many of the great thinkers throughout history did not rely on sudden inspiration alone. They built routines that supported reflection. These routines created regular opportunities for the mind to slow down, examine experience, and restore perspective. In a noisy world, this may be one of the most valuable disciplines a person can develop. A daily thinking ritual. The Stoic philosophers practiced something very close to this idea. They believed that thinking clearly required both preparation and review. In the morning, they would prepare the mind for the day ahead. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that he would encounter impatience, selfishness, and misunderstanding from others. By anticipating these possibilities calmly, he reduced their power to disturb him later. In the evening, they reviewed the day. They asked themselves what had gone well, where they had reacted poorly, and what could be improved tomorrow. This daily reflection was not meant to produce guilt or perfection. It was meant to sharpen awareness. Spinoza approached the mind with a similar sense of discipline. He believed that understanding grows gradually as a person becomes more conscious of the causes behind their thoughts and emotions. Clarity is rarely sudden, it is usually the result of repeated observation. Nietzsche also emphasized the importance of solitude and reflection. He believed that individuals who never step away from the noise of the crowd gradually lose their ability to think independently. A thinking ritual creates distance from that noise. It protects a small space each day where thought is not rushed or directed by external demands. Modern research on attention and habit formation supports this idea. Studies show that when reflective practices are repeated at consistent times, the brain begins to associate those moments with focused thinking. Over time, the transition into a reflective state becomes easier. The mind learns the rhythm. Just as the body adapts to regular sleep schedules, the brain adapts to regular thinking schedules. A daily thinking ritual does not need to be complicated. In fact, the simpler it is, the more likely it will be sustained. Many people find that beginning the day with just a few minutes of quiet reflection changes how the rest of the day unfolds. Before checking messages or absorbing the day's information, the mind briefly asks a few grounding questions. What matters most today? What kind of mindset will help me approach the day clearly? What distractions should I avoid? These questions do not need immediate answers. Their purpose is simply to orient attention. Instead of beginning the day in reaction to external noise, the mind begins from a position of intention. Another useful element of a thinking ritual is writing. A few minutes of journaling can help clarify thoughts before they become tangled in daily responsibilities. Writing does not need to be polished or structured. It simply allows ideas to move from the mind onto the page. This process often reveals patterns that would otherwise remain hidden. Repeated worries become visible. Recurring interpretations appear. Opportunities for clearer thinking emerge. Even brief writing sessions can strengthen awareness of how the mind works. Midday pauses can also play an important role. The modern work environment often pushes attention continuously from one task to the next. Without interruption, the mind becomes fatigued, decision quality declines. Emotional reactivity increases. Short pauses, even a few minutes, allow attention to reset. During these moments, stepping away from screens, taking a few slow breaths, or simply sitting quietly can restore clarity. These pauses function like mental resets, preventing the accumulation of noise throughout the day. Evening reflection completes the cycle. At the end of the day, the mind briefly reviews what occurred. Not with harsh judgment but with curiosity. What situations triggered strong reactions? What interpretations proved inaccurate? Where did clarity help guide decisions? This kind of reflection gradually sharpens awareness. The mind begins to notice patterns in behavior and interpretation. Over time, these patterns become easier to adjust. This daily rhythm, preparation, pause, and reflection, mirrors the cycles found throughout nature. Activity is followed by rest. Action is followed by observation. The mind, like the body, performs best when it moves within this balance. Without reflection, experience passes by without producing insight. With reflection, even ordinary events become sources of learning. Scientific studies on deliberate practice and cognitive performance show that improvement in complex skills rarely occurs through repetition alone. It occurs through repetition combined with reflection. The same principle applies to thinking. People experience thousands of thoughts every day, but without examining those thoughts, clarity does not necessarily increase. A thinking ritual provides the structure needed for that examination. It slows the pace of experience long enough for the mind to learn from it. Over time, this habit produces a quiet transformation. Reactions become less automatic. Interpretations become more flexible. Emotions become easier to understand. The mind becomes steadier, and perhaps most importantly, the individual begins to feel less controlled by the noise of the surrounding world. Information continues to arrive, events continue to occur, but the mind has a stable place to return to each day. A small period of reflection that restores perspective. In a world filled with constant stimulation, building a daily thinking ritual may seem simple, but simplicity does not make it weak. In fact, the most powerful habits are often the quietest ones. Repeated daily, almost unnoticed, gradually shaping the way the mind works. Thinking clearly in a noisy world is not a single decision. It is a rhythm of pausing, examining, and returning to clarity again and again. And when that rhythm becomes part of daily life, the noise around us begins to lose its ability to dominate the mind. The world may remain loud, but the mind becomes steady. And in that steadiness, clarity finds its place.